I gave this presentation about 2 months ago at Texas A&M Commerce to the physics department. I won't tell you what the result was until the end, but you can, actually it was very positive, I'll give you that clue. But I'll tell you about that when we finish, and you can be thinking about how physicists would respond to this kind of evidence. There were about 30 professors and about 20 grad students, and actually it was a slightly abbreviated version of this presentation. And I'm on college campuses about once a month across the country, and we were just up at the University of Akron, and we were speaking there each evening for a week. We had a nasty letter published in the newspaper about midway through the week, and it doubled our crowds. Well, we had this all set and ready to go. All right, here we go, getting close. All right, we're going to be talking about the record of the rocks this evening. And the main theme, as indicated, is going to be the coexistence of humans and dinosaurs. The evolutionists tell us that when we dig down in the rocks, we see the progressive development of life recorded as if recorded by a tape recorder over long periods of time. Over 500 million years, the record that is indicated in the fossil record. And so we're talking primarily about that record, the sedimentary rock record that covers the continents. There's an average of about 1.5 miles of sedimentary rock that covers the continents. It has billions and billions of dead things in it. It's laid down by water, and it covers all the continents. Now, I know a good explanation for that. But there are alternative views that we'll be considering this evening. Is this 1.5 miles of sediment on the average that covers all the continents the result of gradual buildup over millions of years that records the development of life over that period? Or is this a rapid, catastrophic deposition that is a flood deposit? Now, those are two very different views, and we should be able to look at the rock record and tell the difference. Of course, if you believe philosophically in naturalism and you don't want to submit to a creator, then you have to have a slow, gradual explanation for the record of the rocks. I think when you look at the record of the rocks, it's obvious that it was catastrophic, and that stratigraphy indicates a flood deposit and challenges naturalism. Now, we won't have time this evening to look at all of the evidence for flood deposits, but we're going to look particularly at the evidence of coexistence of humans and dinosaurs, which I think is central and critical, and even evolutionists would acknowledge it. But the evolutionary representation of what you find when you dig down in this sedimentary rock record looks like this, the geologic time scale. And down at the bottom you have the very simple animals, and you get more complex as you go up. This is that progression of life supposed to be recorded over millions of years. The biggest problem with this is that it's found only in the textbooks. You can't dig down in the earth and find this complete record anywhere, as any knowledgeable geologist knows, though often you have to get to grad school to understand that. But notice the statement by Leighton Judson, a standard geology text, that says, because we cannot find sedimentary rocks representing all Earth time neatly in one convenient area, we must piece together the rock sequence from locality to locality. It is not found anywhere. It's pieced together. Some over here in Texas and some over in China and some in England. This process of tying one rock sequence in one place to another in some other place is known as correlation. And so it's correlated from various places and not found in any one spot. As the Encyclopedia Britannica says, the end product of correlation is a mental abstraction called the geologic column. Now, many students taking earth science, junior high, high school, even college courses don't grasp this, that it's a mental abstraction, it's a construct. Notice the comment about this by R.H. Rastell, again in the Encyclopedia Britannica from Cambridge. He says, it cannot be denied that geologists are here arguing in a circle, and he's explaining how they come up with this correlation. How do they know what goes on top and what goes on bottom? Because they're picking it from various places. It's not because of where it's found geographically. He says the succession of organisms has been determined by study of the remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the organisms they contain. Now, we can see that circular process, or illustrate it somewhat oversimplified, but it works like this. A person says, I have a primitive fossil here. Well, how do you know that's a primitive fossil? Well, it's found in an old rock. All right, I understand that. But how do you know that this is an old rock? Well, it's got a primitive fossil in it. And we're obviously not proving anything, but this is the correlation process and the way it works. Notice Putman and Bassett's description of this in the textbook Geology, and these are standard geology textbooks used across the country. A rock that had an early form, and notice the assumption, this presumes the thing to be proved to start with, but it's an early form, so where does it go? It goes on the bottom, doesn't it? Clearly older than rocks containing later forms, which would go on the top. Furthermore, all rocks that had the early form, no matter how far apart those rocks were geographically, would have to be the same age. So it's not where, but is it early or late in terms of the evolutionary assumption. In this way, our geologic timetable came into being. Without the theory of evolution and the interdisciplinary science of paleontology, it could not exist. So you use evolution to stack, to order the correlation. And then once you get it stacked, you turn around and say, see, the proof of evolution. Well, no, you have to have evolution in order to build it. Now, again, I'm somewhat oversimplifying, and there are correlations in local sequences that you can follow physically, but when you're talking about the whole column, you're talking about correlation across continents and across oceans, and that's strictly based on the assumptions of evolution. The detailed picture in the textbook could not exist without evolution. You must assume the thing to be proved. I think it is useful as a model, but I think we can look at a number of problems with this. Some perhaps you haven't thought about. When you're looking at this, you see mostly vertebrates, obviously, and when people think about fossils, well, yeah, that's the impressive fossils. The truth of the matter, relatively speaking, vertebrates are virtually non-existent relative to the other fossils. This is a very skewed picture. The fossil record, 95% of it, involves marine invertebrates, animals without backbones, and they're in the ocean. And then most of what's not included in the 95%, the other 4.5, is plants and algae. Far less than 1% involves the vertebrates, 0.025%, about 1/100th of 1%. And so when we're talking about this 1.5 miles of sediment that's covering the continents, we're looking primarily at marine invertebrates. Well, why isn't that represented in the geologic column? Somebody might get the idea we're talking about a flood deposit here, a marine flood deposit. Well, yes, that's what it looks like when you represent it correctly, but they don't. The founding fathers of geology all understood that this was a flood deposit, and that's not represented in the textbook as well. Nicholas Steno is referred to as the father of modern stratigraphy. He's one of the heroes of geology, and he'll be in all of the textbooks. Quoting from Patton's textbook, Evolution of the Earth, besides correctly interpreting fossils, the result was formulation of the most basic principles for analysis of Earth history. Steno showed great insight. Almost 300 years ago, he came up with the explanation that we still use today, and he came up with the means of interpreting the strata. And you have to memorize his 12 axioms or you're not going to pass stratigraphy. And if you get a stratigraphy student who's halfway through the course, he can just rattle them off, all 12 of them, because that's the way you do it. They haven't really improved on it that much. He says, Steno's axioms provide the ultimate basis for practically all interpretation of Earth history, so their importance can hardly be overemphasized. What they don't tell you is that he thought the whole deposit, 1.5 miles in the average, covering the continents, was done in a year-long series of catastrophes produced by the flood. Here is a picture of his book. When I was doing work at Cambridge in England, they had one of the original editions of his book under glass in the Oxford Library, not in the Oxford, in the Trinity Library. The flypiece dedication page says, dedicated to the proof of the Noachian deluge. Now that's where he was coming from, which they don't tell you. One of the things people say when you mention the idea of, well, maybe a flood did this is, well, that's crazy. There's no way a flood would explain what we see in the geologic record. You've got all these separate layers and different groups and segregated groups of animals, and a flood would just make a big mishmash. Of course, they don't know much about floods, which they reveal in such statements, even local floods. And how many of you have seen a universal flood? Don't think so. And it really doesn't correlate that well. You double the velocity of the water, the speed of the water, and you increase the carrying and eroding factor by a factor of 12. The power to carry and to erode 12 times when you increase it twice, or increase it once, double it. It doesn't correlate necessarily with just local floods. It works in multiples. But this was his concept, and it allowed him to write the rules well enough 300 years earlier that we still haven't improved on them that much. He understood geology, and this is what he thought was the best explanation. Building on that, the book Genesis Flood was published in 1961 by Whitcomb and Morris, and they explained, in terms of all we know in 1961, and what we've learned since then, I think, just confirms that. And I think they provided an excellent explanation for the geologic record. John C. McCampbell, who was professor and head of the Department of Geology at the University of Southeastern Louisiana, wrote the foreword. Now, he is an evolutionist and a naturalist, but he fairly appraised this explanation and said the facts of geology do fit, and that the authors have built a very strong case for this explanation and a serious challenge to the standard explanation. Now, he didn't say their view fits and ours doesn't, but that's the way I would have said it. I think it explains much more and much better. Well, but how does a flood produce these segregated groups of animals that we do see? And when you look at this column, yes, you see groups that you can identify as the Cambrian, and other groups you can identify as the Silurian. And how did that come to be? You don't find them all in one place, stacked in that beautiful order. Well, when we look at the way animals live in the world today, we see natural habitats segregate, so that typically you don't find bears and lions living together, do you? Now, you used to back in Bible time, but today you see the ecology has shifted and it's changed. I think the flood buried animals where they lived, and they lived separately from other animals. You don't typically find antelope bones in a coral reef. Not because they're millions of years apart, they just live in different places. And as the floodwaters, a worldwide flood, engulfed the world, it would bury organisms where they lived, and we would see that as the floodwaters rose and buried these animals, they would preserve that habitat in which they lived, and I think it simply reflects the environment in which you found the world at the time of the flood, and it buried it that way. The different groups were buried separately, not because they're millions of years apart, but because some of them lived on the ocean bottom, and some of them lived up on the edge of the ocean, and some of them lived in the swamps, and some of them lived on the plains. Not all stacked in one place, different places around the world. But typically, if you find a swamp here and an ocean bottom over there, which one is going to be lower? Usually, the ocean bottom. Not always. And so a general order would be predicted, but certainly not this skewed, arranged, conceptual correlation that is pictured so often in the textbooks, that is useless as proof of evolution. It's circular logic, which is not useful as proof. It is useful, though, I believe, as a model. Now, what in science, a model is, we understand, the beginning presupposition. Here's an idea. Now, the fact that you illustrate the idea is not proof. But the illustration will serve as a means of testing. And I think that's what the geologic column is useful for. We can test that against the real world to see if the facts fit. And how would you test it? Well, let's allow the evolutionist to describe how this test should proceed. Stephen Stanley of Johns Hopkins refers to topsy-turvy fossils. This would test it, he says. This would disprove evolution. Any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would force us to rethink our theory. We'll look at a more complete rendition of that quote before we're finished. And by the way, the quotes that we're using are all in a handout that will be available for you, that is here. To illustrate, there are animals that are supposed to be at the bottom of the geologic column that may be found up. That would be a topsy-turvy fossil. Well, animals that are supposed to be down near the bottom early in the development are often found at the top. They're what we call living fossils, and so they really don't like to talk about this part of it that much. Niles Eldridge, a cohort of Stephen Gould, curator of invertebrate paleontology at the American Museum of Natural History, says there seems to have been almost no change in any part we can compare. These animals that began back at the bottom of the column, still alive today, and there's not been any change. He says we've not completely solved the riddle of living fossils. They should have evolved, and they shouldn't be alive. They should have been replaced. And he gives a number of illustrations. For example, the horseshoe crab. Now, you see the fossil inset down at the bottom. That's supposed to be 424 million years old. And here's the modern one up near the top, and that's just almost identical. And it would look more identical if we had more dark in here. But anyway, you can see fairly well. They're all over the place, millions of them. That's a topsy-turvy fossil. Keith Thompson, president of the Academy of Natural Sciences, says the horseshoe crabs of today look, of the fossil record, look quite like the modern forms. The last fossils became extinct 50 million years ago. Well, of course, fossils don't become extinct, but I understand what he's talking about. 50 million years, and you've got no fossils. But they're all over the place. Now, that doesn't fit their explanation, because when they quit making fossils, then they're supposed to be extinct, right? Not the way it works. Maybe the most famous living fossil is the coelacanth. This is a fossil fish that lived with the dinosaurs. Here we see Keith Thompson again writing a book about this. He says this is a fish thought to be extinct for 70 million years. A fish, coelacanth, an animal that thrived concurrently with the dinosaurs. And they look quite like modern forms. Yes, we have found them. They're alive. He says, though, we have no coelacanths younger than the late Cretaceous. Now, the late Cretaceous is as late as we find the dinosaurs. We find some above that, which they don't talk about, but not a whole lot. And so they went extinct the same time, basically, the dinosaurs did. And no fossils for 65 million years. And now then we found over 600 of them swimming around in the ocean now. There's something a little fishy about that, isn't there? Here's a news account of a fossil that was found alive in Sydney, Australia, several years ago. David Noble went out on a holiday hike, stepped off the beaten path into the prehistoric age, standing amid trees thought to have disappeared 150 million years ago. Here's a Jurassic Park tree that's been gone since Jurassic Park. The discovery is the equivalent of finding a small dinosaur still alive on the earth, said Carrick Chambers, director of the Royal Botanical Gardens. One of the most dramatic and significant living fossils are graptolites, which everybody knows about, right? Anybody ever heard of a graptolite? Well, if you were a petroleum geologist, you would know all about them. These are very important. These are index fossils, and these particular graptolites are index fossils of the Cambrian. That's the bottom layer in the geologic column. And an index fossil is a fossil that allows you to say, that's a Cambrian graptolite. Therefore, I know this is a Cambrian rock. That dates the rock as Cambrian, because it only lived during this period, died out, and went extinct, except now then they have found them alive, this index fossil of the lowest layer. Quoting from Nature, again of several years ago, this is not new knowledge, and you'll never see it in the textbook. All paleontologists dream of finding a living fossil. Noel Dilly seems to have done so. Graptolites are arguably the most important zone fossil of the lower Paleozoic. This is far from an esoteric issue. Supposed to be gone hundreds of millions of years, still alive. Well, what this does, obviously, is falsify the idea that if you don't find it above a certain point in the geologic record, it went extinct. Now, just over and over again, we've proved that that's not so, and yet they still say that, no matter how many examples you find. These are topsy-turvy fossils, the ones that are supposed to be up that are found down. That does falsify the extinction hypothesis. But there's so many of them, they've kind of gotten immune to that. And they say, wait a minute, that's not what you need to find. What you need to find is things that are supposed to be the other way around. Things that are supposed to be up that are found down. Now, maybe you can have things living on the razor edge of extinction for 70 million years and no fossils after having a bunch of them for a long time, and then still be alive. That's incredible, but they can imagine that. But how in the world can you take something that didn't develop till hundreds of millions of years later and get it back down at the bottom? Now, that would just rip it, wouldn't it? And they acknowledge that, that's not going to work. Richard Dawkins of Oxford, one of the most vicious anti-creationists in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, says we should be very surprised, for example, to find fossil humans appearing in the record before mammals are supposed to have evolved. If a single well-verified mammal skull were to turn up in 500 million-year-old rocks, our whole modern theory of evolution would be utterly destroyed. Things supposed to be up, found down. Now, I think the logic is virtually the same going the other way, but coming this way, they just give up at this point. Now, that sounds like a very scientific way to proceed. Here's a test, and science proceeds by such test, and they're verified or falsified. But it's not quite as simple as you think, because we found this kind of thing all over the place. For example, near LaSalle, Utah, here are perfectly modern human bones 50 feet down in the Dakota sandstone, the same formation that you find at Dinosaur National Monument. This Dakota sandstone is famous for its dinosaurs. Well, they must have fallen down a crack in the rock. No, we don't have to find the crack. You just know that has to happen. Or they crawled back in a cave that collapsed on them. Of course, there are no broken bones. Well, maybe they were mining and it collapsed on them. Again, no broken bones. We've got 10 of these skeletons now, and 5 of them were males, 4 of them were females, 1 was an infant, and no tools and no broken bones. It doesn't sound like a mine cave-in to me. But whatever, it has to be an intrusional burial because we know humans and dinosaurs didn't live together. And so the real key phrase in this statement is if it's well verified. And guess what? It ain't going to be verified. Whatever it takes, it won't be. Well, we've done a good bit of work at this site. We went back to see if it could be well verified. This is near LaSalle, Utah, about 25 miles south of Moab. And it's an open pit copper mine. And about where you see the backhoe is where most of the skeletons were found, a little bit to the left and then at that spot. And here you can see they're still embedded in the rock in the process of being removed 50 feet down in this layer. That one was articulated as in life. This one is just washed into place, the 2 bones there near the center that look like they go together. They really don't. They're just washed together, pile of bones. Most of them are replaced with malachite, which shows that this is not a recent burial. It's not just a staining, as some have claimed. Some of them are 100% replaced, though most fossils are not 100%. And not all of these are 100%, but some of them are. There's no collagen. The standard rule is it takes at least 1,000 years for the collagen to disappear. And so we're looking here at one of those turvy fossils. We'll call the other ones topsy. These will be the turvy fossils. Is it possible they fell down a crack? Well, we talked to Dale Fuller, who was the one who was driving the bulldozer when this was initially uncovered, and he showed us exactly where this happened. He said there was no breaks in the rock at all. He didn't see any, and it had been taken down. This is a side view. And this is the area where, back in the 30s, they began mining here, and actually his father drove the bulldozer at this point, and they hit a layer that was so hard it was tearing up the bulldozer, and they had to stop, though it was a profitable copper mine. And then in the 70s, developed better equipment, better techniques, and then came on down to this level in the 70s. And at that point, in the early 70s, is when the first 2 were found. And then in the early 90s, we found a good many more. Looking at a diagram of this cross-section, we see the mining operation of the 30s and the 70s. The road cut was cut in the 30s, so that before the 30s, that all went straight across. And the skeletons were found right here. 50 feet down, and before 1930, this was the profile. When you look at the state of replacement, and there have been a number of radiocarbon dates ranging anywhere from, one says 200, though it was right in the middle of a spring, obviously contaminated, all the way up to 4,000, 1,500. It ranges all over the place, so I think it's obviously contaminated. But obviously, if it's older than just a few hundred years, certainly a few thousand years, then there's serious problems here for the evolutionists. This would not be intrusionally buried 50 feet down in the Dakota sandstone, especially with intervening layers of extremely hard sandstone. Now again, let's remember the implication according to the evolutionist himself. If you find this kind of thing, evolution would be utterly destroyed. I think we have well verified it. But he won't and can't afford to. In the same context in this book, he goes on to say, ironically, it's also the reason why creationists are so keen on the fake human footprints which were carved during the Depression to fool tourists in the dinosaur beds of Texas. And he's heard about our work all the way from Oxford, but of course he has been sitting behind his desk in Oxford. He's not going to come to Texas and look. But he's sure that they're fake. Now, the interest in the footprints might surprise some because obviously bones would seem to be better evidence, but not really. Because you can erode the bones and redeposit them. They can fall down cracks. But you can't do that with footprints, can you? Footprints are not going to be intrusionally buried. Can't be. You erode them, they're gone. And so this is really better from that standpoint. It completely eliminates the intrusional burial objection. We've been doing work for the past 20 years in Dinosaur Valley State Park down at Glen Rose. And this is the Paluxy River that runs through that park, where there are just literally thousands of dinosaur tracks. If you like a good place to take a vacation, that's a neat spot. Come down and help us dig up some tracks. These were excavated back in the early 40s by Roland T. Byrd. In addition to these depressed tracks, the four-toed big sauropods and the three-toed tracks, you find some, and many actually, that are slightly raised. Now, what in the world's going on here? Wouldn't a footprint be depressed? Yes, the footprint is depressed, and then other material washes in and fills in that depressed track, and sometimes that infill material then becomes harder rock than the surrounding material that the dinosaur stepped in. And that harder rock is then resistant to erosion, and as it's subsequently exposed and erosion exposes it, it's resistant and then is slightly raised. Now that'll be important when we get further into the presentation. We also find tracks that look like this. Well, this one has to be carved. Why? Well, look at it. It's human. And I think we were somewhat intimidated by that. It's just too good to be true was one explanation. So we looked around for some that weren't quite so good, which we were able to find as well. In the lower right-hand corner, I gave this presentation about 2 months ago at Texas A&M Commerce to the physics department. I won't tell you what the result was until the end, but you can, actually it was very positive. I'll give you that clue. But I'll tell you about that when we finish, and you can be thinking about how physicists would respond to this kind of evidence. There were about 30 professors and about 20 grad students, and actually it was a slightly abbreviated version of this presentation. And I'm on college campuses about once a month across the country, and we were just up at the University of Akron, and we were speaking there each evening for a week. That is a flood deposit. Now, those are two very different views, and we should be able to look at the rock record and tell the difference. Of course, if you believe philosophically in naturalism and you don't want to submit to a creator, then you have to have a slow, gradual explanation for the record of the rocks. I think when you look at the record of the rocks, it's obvious that it was catastrophic, and that stratigraphy indicates a flood deposit and challenges naturalism. Now, we won't have time this evening to look at all of the evidence for flood deposits, but we're going to look particularly at the evidence of coexistence of humans and dinosaurs, which I think is central and critical, and even evolutionists would acknowledge it. But the evolutionary representation of what you find when you dig down in this sedimentary rock record looks like this, the geologic time scale. And down at the bottom you have the very simple animals, and you get more complex as you go up. This is that progression of, we see the progressive development of life recorded as if recorded by a tape recorder over long periods of time, over 500 million years, the record that is indicated in the fossil record. And so we're talking primarily about that record, the sedimentary rock record that covers the continents. There's an average of about 1.5 miles of sedimentary rock that covers the continents. It has billions and billions of dead things in it. It's laid down by water, and it covers all the continents. Now, I know a good explanation for that. But there are alternative views that we'll be considering this evening. Is this 1.5 miles of sediment on the average that covers all the continents the result of gradual buildup over millions of years that records the development of life over that period? Or is this a rapid, catastrophic deposition of life supposed to be recorded over millions of years? The biggest problem with this is that it's found only in the textbooks. You can't dig down in the earth and find this complete record anywhere, as any knowledgeable geologist knows, though often you have to get to grad school to understand that. But notice the statement by Leighton Judson, a standard geology text, that says, because we cannot find sedimentary rocks representing all earth time neatly in one convenient area, we must piece together the rock sequence from locality to locality. It is not found anywhere. It's pieced together. Some over here in Texas and some over in China and some in England. This process of tying one rock sequence in one place to another in some other place is known as correlation. And so it's correlated from various places and not found in any one spot. As the Encyclopedia Britannica says, the end product of correlation. We had a nasty letter published in the newspaper about midway through the week, and it doubled our crowds. Well, we had this all set and ready to go. All right, here we go, getting close. All right, we're going to be talking about the record of the rocks this evening. And the main theme, as indicated, is going to be the coexistence of humans and dinosaurs. The evolutionists tell us that when we dig down in the rocks,